give us until 2:02 instead of 2:01 to grab any last people who need some water. And I'll get a glass of water myself. Perfect. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our practitioner meeting. My name is Evan Manville. I'm a land use and transportation planner here at the LCD, he, him pronouns. We've been doing a whole bunch of different engagement things. We're really trying to hear from local practitioners how these draft rules may work and may be applied in your region. We had one yesterday and another one this morning, another one here. So it's really helpful. So thanks for making the time to give us some feedback on the draft rules and give us some insights. The staff will introduce themselves as they present, when they present, but I do want to have the non-DLCD staff go around and just let us know who you are. I will call on you, starting with Russell.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Russ Grayson. I am the Chief Operating Officer / Assistant City Manager for the city, but I'm also still kind of covering double duty. Before this, I was the Community Development Director for the city as well for 6 years. So overseeing planning, growth management, building, engineering, all that.
Thank you.
I appreciate you taking time to talk to us today.
Yeah. Damien.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Damian Srinick. I'm a senior planner with the Growth Management Division, and currently serving as the city's rep on the RAC as an alternate.
Thank you for your service. Mary Alice.
Hi, I'm Mary Winters. I'm the city attorney at Bend.
Wonderful. Andrea.
Hello, I'm Andrea Napoli. I work for the Bend MPO. I'm a senior planner.
Peter.
Peter Russell. I'm the senior transportation planner for Deschutes County, which is part of the Bend MPO.
Great. Elizabeth.
Elizabeth Oshel, assistant city attorney for the city of Bend.
Great. Brian.
Brian Oshel.
Sorry, Brian Rankin. Yes.
Every time.
Every time. Yeah. Brian Ryan. I'm the long range planning manager for the city of Bend.
Great. And now you're all juggling on my, okay, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Ryan Oster, I'm the engineering director for the city of Bend.
Wonderful. And it looks like Tyler is connecting to audio. Tyler Deek. I do, before we get into the presentation, also want to highlight Nicole Mardell, who is a new regional rep for us. Who is sitting in until we finalize a longer term regional rep, but she will service you. Nicole, you want to say hi to folks?
Yeah, hi everyone. For those who haven't met, I actually live in Bend, so I'm your local rep, but I actually just accepted a position with the Mid-Willamette Valley region. So I'm just filling in until a new Central Oregon regional rep is hired, but feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Happy to connect you with any resources.
Thanks, Nicole. And Tyler, you want to introduce yourself and your role?
Hey everyone, this is Tyler Deakey, and I'm manager of the Bend MPO, and just listening, and we'll be helping or working with the city as they work to implement the new rules.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're gonna try to do a really quick run through the rules because some of you know them well and some of them probably peripherally, and leave a bunch of time for a discussion. So this is going to be a quick run through, and hopefully that's a good use of people's time. Yeah, kind kind of covering all the various things briefly, and then giving you a chance to ask questions about specific things, and reviewing the schedule at the end, and how we're going to engage and get these adopted. First, I want to kind of note the draft rules calendar. These are the responsibilities for your 2 jurisdictions. CFA stands for Climate Friendly Area Designation. So that's what CFA DES stands for. Climate Friendly Area Zone Housing Needs Analysis is HNA. And then some parking reform and some reporting things. So a lot of the rules will trigger on a TSP update, on a Transportation System Plan update. But those are some draft dates that we have for some other responsibilities. Real quick, why are we doing this rulemaking? I think we all know this, but we are very far off track of meeting our climate pollution reduction goals. We set goals, and our current plans and investments aren't going to get us anywhere near where we want to get. By 2050, we're going to be off by kind of a factor of 4, or 4 times as much transportation pollution as we're hoping if current trends continue. And we're all suffering because of this across Oregon, the wildfires and the heat waves and the ice storms. And it's been really costly thus far. Secondly, inequity and generational wealth. Our land use system and transportation investments have created a lot of inequities based on rhythm and other things. And because of those inequities, those who had homes back 40, 50, 60 years ago passed that intergenerationally. And the outcome is white families these days have an average of roughly 10 times the wealth as Black households. So so we got a lot of work to do on equity. That's just a couple of examples. Lastly, kind of just a trend thing. We really want to rethink where we're going, because what we look like changes. Our households are completely different than they were when some of our plans and planning goals were set up. A couple of generations ago, nuclear families were the dominant form of households, and now single person households are about 1/3 of all households, and those trends are going to continue. So we got to think about our communities differently and how our households work differently. The governor ordered us to take serious action on climate. She was very aware that we are far off track. She issued a broad-reaching climate executive order in March of 2020, aimed at a lot of different agencies, including ours, kind of saying, hey, get to it, exercise your authority, move quickly, and as you do so, prioritize equity. But this isn't all about gloom and doom. This is about great places. You all have great places in your community. We're looking for more places like downtown McMinnville, which is pictured, which is a place that people can live and work and do errands and shop and eat and meet their daily needs without having to get in a car. We don't need that to be everyone living there. If about 1/3 of Oregonians live there, our model shows that we can kind of be doing the land use part of the climate pollution reduction. The rulemaking is focused just on these 8 areas. There's Bend, the 8 MPOs where most people live in Oregon and where most pollution happens and where most progress on transportation pollution reduction can happen. We've had as Damien mentioned, a rulemaking advisory committee. This much larger and more diverse advisory committee than we've had in the past. Based on our commitment to equity, we brought voices into the room that traditionally aren't in the room. So it hasn't just been a bunch of land use planners or land use planning advocates. It's been much more racially diverse, people with disabilities representing people experiencing homelessness, more renters, just a different set of voices, as well as representatives from all 8 of those metro areas. So it's been a very engaging and thoughtful process, and I've really appreciated it. They have had 9 meetings thus far, and we'll have another 2 or 3. There are 2 categories of the rulemaking. The first is regional scenario planning. which is kind of a region working together to figure out their mix of actions to meet the climate pollution reduction goals. That's on a much longer timeline for Bend than the bigger metro areas. So it's not a major focus. The other is 6 things the commission identified as key things we can do in our land use system. And we'll go through those bit by bit as the presentation continues. And there's performance monitoring and reporting under both of these kind of threads. Cody, you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yep. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cody Meyer, land use transportation planner with DLCD. I'm just going to go over a quick 5 minutes here, and then any questions we can or comments we can go into that, and then we'll go over to some next topics. Is our agenda here. So as Evan mentioned, we have had a Division 44 rules for greenhouse gas reduction targets for about 10 years now. And that really kind of has largely centered on a process to do scenario planning as a region to reach those targets. Our commission charge said, Eugene, Springfield, you guys should do that. Salem, Kaiser as the next 2 biggest MPOs next to Metro, you guys should be engaging in that process. For everybody else, what we are doing is aligning the local transportation system planning with those targets and setting up a recurring monitoring and reporting framework. So you will see in the draft rules Division 44, there is a connection to the transportation project list for TSP to achieving those VMT reduction targets that are found in Division 44. And we also have this regional kind of scoped reporting regime. And so, just a quick snapshot here is that the statewide transportation strategy for, 10 years or so now has had kind of regional goal areas that different sized metropolitan areas need to get to these levels of action to reach our goals. And our targets are really centered on that. They're built on this default set of assumptions. So what we've done is created a framework where we can use those values, like where do we need to go in the city, in the region of Bend, to get to these outcomes of the greenhouse gas targets. And so those are going to be used really to show how far we need to get across transit level of service, population, living near transit or mixed use areas or different levels, different policy levers. And in the rules 900 through 915 show the framework of how do these reports occur, that they are an annual report, which is basically a very qualitative report. What have we been up to do different things in the jurisdiction over the last year? And then every 4 or 5 years, and we'd like to align that with the regional transportation plan for each region, knowing that there's a lot of data gathering, and a lot of the data for this would be available then in fresh data, to kind of submit these reports on these local performance measures. And so developing performance targets and reporting on these local performance measures is how that's set up. And if a region wants to do scenario planning and come up with different levels of action, that's in the rules that regions can say, hey, we want to do this and come up with our own custom mix. Or we really have a pretty good idea of what different types of actions and what levels of ambition are going to be necessary for everyone in the state. And we've done a lot of this work, and we're not finding any surprisingly new answers. It's just a different way of customizing the blend.
Do you want to pause for questions here?
I am pausing.
Yeah. I mean, everyone, do you have questions for Cody? Damien.
Thank you. I'm going to try to ask 2 questions here while I've got the floor. So schedule, I just want to confirm that if these rules are passed, say tomorrow, it looks like the department would be working with Central Lane and Salem Kaiser MPOs first to work with them on their scenario and modeling. And then after that work would be done, would there be some kind of scheduling with the city of Bend to calendar that works so we know when we're doing it? And if so, is there going to be budget available to help us with scenario work, modeling related to that? What kind of modeling software have you been using with other jurisdictions? Has it been I'm assuming it's something other than the regional travel demand model. But if there's like a recommended model or something we're already using is possible, let me know. Let us know, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I have two answers there. One is that for the scenario planning process to come up with the kind of, this is a scenario plan and this is how you do it. And that's all in Division 44. You're correct. That is how it's going to be rolled out. There's two things in that division in the draft rules. One says the commission can issue an enforcement order, say, I'm just going hypothetical, Ben, you need to undergo scenario planning to do this process. So they have some criteria which they can use to issue that. The second is a jurisdiction such as Ben could say, hey, we want to do this, and we can ask for that. So there's an opt-in process there. To get to this reporting stuff that I'm talking about is that concurrent with all the work we're doing in Eugene, Springfield, Salem, Kaiser, we are also going to be funding the inventory work and data gathering to set up the performance management system for the jurisdictions in the metropolitan areas. So we will be gathering these local inventories that we'll need for bike level traffic stress or different indicators. And then we will be kind of helping jurisdictions compare those to where this STS shows these different things connect. They're not a one-to-one connection, so there's kind of a translation there, but we will be supporting that as well. So that's a way to get folks on the ground. And really the scenario planning process, it's pretty fancy, complicated process, but it really results in implementation and performance monitoring, right? Like you set where you want to go, and then you're just course correcting and implementing and monitoring your work over time. And that's, Metro's been on that track for 5-6 years now, and they're not redoing the plan, they're just taking bites out of that apple to get to that vision that they want to go through performance measures.
Okay, thank you.
Andrea?
Yeah, so my question for the assessment of current plans, this is just TSPs. Is this correct? My question is, do you also include transit plans, like a transit master plan?
You'll want to look in the TPR 0910 rules, and those are the default performance measures. And so there's land use stuff for like the CFAs. There is some bike ped. So there's a lot of TSP related stuff, but there also is some land use stuff that would pertain to the comp plan. And there's some parking performance measure, I think, a couple others. So I think it goes probably beyond, and it really depends on where you park that stuff in your plans.
Okay, and transit too, I'm assuming.
Yeah, but we recognize that transit is not the responsibility of the local government to do transit level of service. So there isn't a performance measure that, well, there might be, but we recognize that that's outside your jurisdiction, is to provide transit.
Okay.
I'm trying to raise my hand. I can't quite find the function.
Go for it, Brian.
Are we using the travel demand model? Is that what the model will be or is assumed to be?
I would say that we are pretty agnostic, and we don't want to specify tools in the draft rules. We want to be flexible. So certainly a lot of this is built on a travel demand model, but not necessarily asking, none of these performance measures we're asking for mean that you have to run the travel demand model. So a lot of the input data you would pull from there. It's being gathered at the time of the RTP updates. You're, updating your TAZ layers. You're looking at where we, priced parking around the region, these kind of data things, but we're not asking you to run the travel demand model.
So I guess the question becomes the tool, because I think otherwise doesn't TPR require us to use a travel demand model, at least as it was currently written. So I know the MPO uses travel demand model. Cities are required to do said report BMT. If that's the model we're supposed to use, can that model do this work? And if not, then what are cities supposed to do, and what are the tools that you would suggest that they use and quite frankly have to invest in?
Yeah, I think that we expect that most TSPs are being developed using a travel demand model that's being hosted by the MPO or ODOT or both. And so that is certainly one tool that can be used for some of the analysis and the VMT reduction targets. Like I said, we're not putting anything in the rule that says you have to use a travel demand model. It's totally allowed, but we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner and be very specific on tools when we know that those change and there's innovation happening. So it's more of an outcomes, like demonstrate how you get to this outcome, and then.
Yeah, I understand that. I appreciate the flexibility. I think what I'm getting at here is if the travel demand model does not pick up on the indicators and performance metrics that you're requiring us to report on, then you are in essence requiring a city to then adopt and use a new model, which I will tell you is a major undertaking, and no model is perfect. So I'm trying to get some guidance on, well, if we're going to have to report on this and do this work, and we have flexibility, then you get into this question, well, which tool, which is the best? And then you can get into, I would call it kind of a technical differences of opinion, which we've run into in the past as well, which is this model might, 10 different models would say 10 different things. So is the LCD going to be deferential to communities, or are you going to be insisting on the travel demand model? And you can see some tensions that would naturally result from this. And so that's naturally a concern. It's a major investment for a city in multiple departments to take on a new model. And I don't believe the travel demand model hits on all the performance metrics that you are asking MPOs and cities to report on. So
we are offering to help support and pay for the performance monitoring performance measures. So bike level traffic stress is probably the most resource intensive. That's a pretty well-defined process. And it's I wouldn't say a model, because it's a bunch of data layers, right? And you put them together, but I think that we are more than willing to work with jurisdictions on coming up with and sharing best tools and practices, and try not to paint you into a corner, like I said.
Thank you.
Yep. And as this conversation goes, if people want to dig more into the details, the person presenting is the person to reach out to outside of this meeting. But any other questions about this section?
So, Cody, I wanted to just go back to the transit section you were talking about. And you can tell me if this is too much into the weeds, it's fine. And I'm just trying to understand the intent of the rules. I was taking a look at like the 0700 on public transportation planning. And it all starts out kind of fine, and what I'm used to seeing, where cities have to coordinate with transit providers, because we're a city that divested completely of transit. So we used to run it, and now it's completely run by Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council. So CIC runs all transit, and the city has no planning, and they just adopted a master plan through 2040 for their transit system. So when the rules go on to talk about how we must do an inventory, we must plan for filling gaps, my mind, the lawyer in me goes straight to, oh, well, we have an IGA. Do we have to redo our IGA? But we can't force them to fill gaps for which they don't have funding. And we had an experience with our UGB expansion where we got sued at LUBA for our water system, our private water utilities not having adequate plans. And Landwatch of Oregon raised that as an issue under Goal 11. And we were ultimately successful, but there the law actually required us to incorporate those plans into our Goal 11 water system plan. Here, I don't really see anything requiring, like there's no obligations on transit here. They're all on cities. And I'm thinking, well, we have no authority to require transit to do anything. We have no statutory, we have no legal. All we do is work with them cooperatively, but we can't make them plan for, I mean, we do cooperate with them, but some of the language in this rule seems to put obligations on cities for a system we don't run. So I'm trying to understand DLCD's intent for those cities that don't run transit systems at all. Not in the planning and coordination, but in the actual obligations, inventories, filling gaps, funding, making sure that things get built. Like, how would we do that?
I think Bill has the answer for you. I want to just quickly, since we're on the performance monitoring stuff, say that the performance measures look at how many households are being planned for or, built in near transit. So it's the performance measure is really looking at the land use aspect in relation to the transit lines and the transit priority corridors. But Bill, I think, could get more to your question for the Rule 700.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Bill Holmstrom, I'm the agency's land use and transportation planning coordinator, and along with Kevin Young, one of the staff co-managers of the rulemaking project. So I think we're going a little out of order, but that's okay. So when it comes to the public transportation, absolutely, we hear loud and clear that Bend is not alone in not being the transit provider for the city, right? You've got a separate entity that does that, and that's the case in most of the metropolitan areas. There's only, I think, 2 that I can think of where the city operates the local transit, and the rest of the places it is a separate entity. So we are trying to consider that, but let's keep in mind that the transportation system plan is it's part of the comprehensive plan for the city, and it's supposed to lay out kind of the transportation, the whole transportation system plan, regardless of who the service provider is. So the local transit provider is supposed to be consistent with the local comprehensive plan. Now, you said you don't have any authority over the local transit district. We understand that. The problem is we don't either. The commission doesn't. Our authority is over local governments, over cities, counties, and metro. That's who DLCD has the opportunity to regulate, and to an extent other state agencies, but mostly it's those local governments. So when we are putting together the public transportation section, what we're trying to think about is what's important for the local government side of things. You don't control where the buses go. You don't control how often they run. You don't control how many, what the fare is or anything like that. All that stuff is handled by the local transit authority. Totally get it. So in order to meet our goals, we need to have a robust transit service. We know we need about 4 times as much transit service as we have on the street now in order to meet our climate goals. LCDC can't just conjure the money for that. Unfortunately, that has to come from the legislature or somewhere else. So we're trying to set the groundwork for a future when we have a higher level of transit service. And the pieces where we think we can be successful are, and that we're trying to set the ground level for, is land use, and making sure that we have transit supportive land uses along planned transit corridors to support that level of transit that we expect to have in the future. And the other piece of it, which we see a little bit in the rules, which is about the right-of-way and local rights-of-way, where you have high levels of transit service that will run or could run in the future, that you're planning to prioritize transit movements along those rights-of-way. Those are the 2 elements where we think we can have local governments have a hand in it. If you think there's something in the rules that is not quite right, or that we've stepped a little bit too far, I'm happy to have that conversation, specifically on there. The inventory elements are really just like what's on the ground right now. Like I said, we expect in the future there to be, in order to meet our goals, and we're assuming that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to head in this direction, which, we aren't in control of all the things to get us there. We're only in control of the things we can control. And if we need to kind of assume we're going that direction, that means there's a lot more transit on the street in the future. And so that's what we're trying to plan for.
Okay.
Do you have a quick follow-up, or shall we keep moving a bit? Or
No, that helps explain the intent. The implementation is tricky and especially since, like here, they just went through a massive planning process. So we can just kind of take what's given and what their funding is. And, but thank you for the explanation.
Yeah, and you're absolutely not in a unique situation for sure. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Let's get moving. Let's get into the kind of the 6 subject areas that the rules the commission directed us to address in the rules. So first is climate friendly areas. Kevin.
Thanks, Evan. So this team seems like, oh, by the way, Kevin Young, Senior Urban Planner with DLCD, along with Bill, I'm one of the project managers for this effort. I'm really focused on the climate friendly area stuff. So that's why I'm talking about it today. It seems like this group has done their homework, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I want to allow enough time for questions and conversation afterwards. But in a nutshell, climate friendly area requirements will require cities to designate climate-friendly areas that are walkable mixed-use areas. These are areas that allow residential, office, retail services, public uses. I believe City of Bend already has zones that are mixed use and supporting these goals to a degree. The area or areas, local governments can designate one climate-friendly area or multiple climate-friendly areas, must be sized to accommodate at least 30% of that local government's housing needs. That's for cities with population over 10,000. But when I say 30%, it is a different analysis than the analysis that is used for example, a housing needs analysis where you're basing your 30% on past production. The rule language provides some level of specificity as to how to calculate capacity for housing within these areas. And it's basically a calculation, based on building footprints that are available based on zoning allowances within these areas. Climate-friendly areas will need to have, of course, high-quality pedestrian, bike, and transit services. Associated also with climate-friendly areas are requirements for parking management and some reductions in on-site parking mandates. The rules, and I'm speaking to the most current draft rules. You may have seen an earlier draft. Just to be clear, the current draft allows for abutting high-density residential or employment areas to be included because those also will support our goals in the climate-friendly areas. And our goal, of course, ultimately is to reduce single-occupant vehicle trips. We're trying to create areas where people can live and work and get their needs met without having to rely on the automobile for most of their trips. As part of this package, local governments will be allowed to choose between prescriptive or outcome-based standards, and I'll just talk about those briefly on the next slide. So this is a table, oops, there we go. This is a table that kind of summarizes those prescriptive standards, or sort of those blue columns there in the middle. To the right are the outcome-oriented standards. I think that appears to be orange. Local governments can choose one or the other, and the standards are kind of scaled based on the population size of the local government. I think Bend currently is just below 100,000 and would fall into that category. And so the prescriptive standards, for example, would require minimum residential densities in these areas of 25 dwelling units per net acre, and would require the local government to allow buildings up to 85 feet. It's not requiring buildings to be constructed to that height, but simply to allow them to be constructed to 85 feet. In that central CFA, if there are other CFAs, those can actually have a lower building height allowed. Alternatively, if the local government has a set of standards that are meeting these goals and resulting in an average of 40 homes and jobs per net acre, the local government has the ability to say, hey, we've got these development standards, or we're working on a package of development standards that are different from the prescriptive standards, but will achieve the same outcomes. So there's some flexibility involved, allowed in those provisions. Next slide, please. And in terms of implementation, we now have a phased implementation process. So the first step is for local governments to designate the climate-friendly areas by June 30 of 2023, a little more than a year after we anticipate the rules will be adopted. That designation is essentially identifying, we think these areas are this area or these areas are going to be our climate-friendly areas. There's also associated analysis of equitable housing outcomes that looks at potential for displacement that might otherwise occur, identifies mitigation that can be used to address displacement of underserved populations that may currently reside in these areas, because that is kind of the last outcome that we would want to see with the CFA designation. So that piece is built in at the beginning. Then 1 year later, June 30, 2024, is the deadline for local governments to actually adopt the zoning and comp plan amendments for those areas. So whatever that package of development standards is. Also associated with the designation is a different transportation review process. This is different from the significant effect analysis under 0060, the current rule, which is really focused on, motor vehicle impacts. This review process analyzes gaps for a variety of transportation modes, pedestrian, bike, transit, and requires planning to fill those gaps, again, to get to that high quality infrastructure for alternative transportation modes. In some circumstances, highway impacts analysis would be required, particularly where we're in close proximity to a intersection of state highway or an interchange, something along those lines. Next slide, please. And then lastly, I want to speak to how this, our proposed changes to the housing rule also will implement these standards. Firstly, cities with population over 10,000 would be required to monitor and report on housing production in climate-friendly areas as part of the housing production strategy work that's now required for House Bill 2003. So in the Bend region, that's every 8 years. And part of that required reporting will be housing produced within climate-friendly areas, including affordable housing. Another component of this rule relates to UGB expansions. And so as currently written, the rule requires that beginning June 30 of 2027, UGB expansions based on residential needs will trigger additional climate-friendly area designation. And that area needs to be sized to accommodate half of the additional residential need. That doesn't mean that the climate-friendly area would be in a UGB expansion area. It could be anywhere in the community where it makes sense. The other piece that I think is important to explain is it is not based, the size of that climate-friendly area, again, is based on theoretical building envelope and housing that might be accommodated in those areas, not based on past production as is currently the practice and will continue under the housing needs analysis or housing capacity analysis process for local governments. Okay, that's enough on that. If there are any questions or discussion, happy to take those.
Brian, and Damian.
To unmute there. Thank you, Kevin. Just some questions. So 30% of housing need in CFAs. So presumably a community would need to essentially do the work to determine what that 20-year housing need is prior, correct?
Right, correct.
Okay. So really, I mean, unless you're designating based on your current housing need, which is probably not going to work. Functionally speaking, you're going to have to project out what's your new 20-year housing need.
I will say, as the current rule is written, if you're not doing housing, an HCA or HNA in the near term, it would just revert back to whatever your findings were under your current adopted acknowledged plan in terms of your identified housing need.
We're Bend, so we're on schedule to be doing this anyway. So here's kind of my point. It's the deadline. Mm-hmm. So what you're essentially driving with this deadline are the following types of work. an update of your housing capacity analysis, needs analysis, your EOA as well. Because keep in mind that climate-friendly areas are going to be designated in existing city cores, most of which are probably going to be employment lands. So there's a conflict here between goal 9 and 10. So if you're essentially putting climate-friendly designations over employment land, you're going to have to reconcile housing need and employment land need at the same time. So you have need for housing, need for employment, buildable lands inventory, and the designation of these climate-friendly areas. And in Ben's situation, there's likely to be some kind of unmet need somewhere between employment and housing. There may or may not be, but let's presume there's an unmet need. And we can't necessarily adopt these documents unless we're fulfilling that 20-year need. If a UGB expansion is required, And if that's the case, then we're also looking at a TSP amendment, because we're going to be affecting densities within the current urban growth boundary. And very likely you could have some impacts there on various roadways. We'd be doing this new highway analysis as well. And so my point is that that's a heck of a lot of work, almost an insurmountable amount of work to accomplish within a 1-2 year time frame. And so we can be all on board with the rules and substance of the rules. I think if you're looking for inclusion, participation, and a public conversation about this, and all this additional technical analysis, you're simply not allowing enough time and space for that to occur within this deadline. So the major concern is deadline. And then there are, of course, technical questions that kind of come along with that as well, on how you're actually calculating the amount of housing that could theoretically be built inside of a CFA. So I don't know if you can just speak to that and why that deadline in this case, because you are triggering a whole bunch of stuff through that deadline that I just don't think can really get done unless you have a massive investment in doing all this work right off the bat.
All right, so a couple of things. First of all, I forget when your H&A, your next update, is it due 2023? I can't remember. We showed the graphic, and I know it had
it's somewhere in roughly in the same time frame, but
in the same time frame. So I believe, if I'm remembering the rule right, that's December. So yeah, I guess, okay. So because we've got that phased implementation, and we're looking at zoning coming in 2024, that does create a little bit of a wrinkle. So at what point do you rely on your existing plans? And that's something that we really do need to flesh out in the rules. So is it your initial PAPA submittal or something like that? Because as I've been thinking about it, you have adopted and acknowledged plans currently. You could work from those to establish CFAs. I understand Bend is really fast growing, and you're needing to stay on top of that. It may be best to think a little bit more about kind of how all those pieces fit together. I agree, it's a complicated puzzle.
Well, I have thought about it. It's what I'm telling you is that the timelines they're not reasonable to do all that work, because in Ben's situation, because we're a fast growing community, we're very like both employment and housing. So it's not just one, it's both. We can't adopt that housing needs analysis unless we also adopt the measures to accommodate the need, which in Bend has naturally, typically in the past, has led to UGB expansions. So what you're saying practically for both of these timelines is, hey, why don't you just do all of this work, and including the TSP update and including all these rules, all within the next year to hit your CFA deadlines, as well as your H&A deadlines and HCA deadlines. So I have concerns about the timing that has been imposed from the state without really thinking through what that means for a community, and a community that wants to do the work, I might add. This is not a community that's obstinate. We're looking forward and trying to figure out how to do it. And I think the number one concern is, holy smokes, you're asking to package a whole lot of work together really quickly, which has budgetary impacts, staffing impacts, and the staff that are working on this are also working on the other components of the rulemaking that you're doing. So I guess we're just saying, mercy. A year does a lot in terms of the timeline.
No, that's very helpful, Brian. And if you could flesh out, I mean, what you've said and provide that to us, I think that'd be super helpful as we think through these kind of issues.
Thank you for listening. Not trying to be a complainer. Just want to get work done well.
No, I understand. I understand.
Damien, do you have a quick question?
Probably not, but I'll try to make it as quick as I can. So just to comment, to add a little levity. So Kevin, just so you know, according to PSU, we are now a city over 100,000. Not by much, but we're now in the big leagues in Oregon. And so as we're looking at these rules, we're looking at those that apply to cities of that size or larger. But I want to talk about, or my questions really revolve around CFAs with respect to employment land. And I think it was maybe the last RAC meeting or commission meeting, I was looking at some comments from some of the stakeholders about how we've addressed housing and looking at meeting a larger percentage of our housing needs in CFAs. And they had raised the question about employment. And it's something that we're starting to think about as a city because, I expect early next year, we're going to be getting to work on our EOA update along with an economic development strategy. So my question is, has the team thought about what extent employment land needs are met within CFAs? If so, is it going to be commensurate with what we're looking at in terms of meeting our housing needs, or is that something that still needs some work?
We're certainly talking about it, and I understand. I mean, we need both. We need employment and we need housing in these areas in order for them to really do what we need them to do. The focus on housing is because we already have the architecture to look at housing and to promote housing development. We're having conversations with our economic development folks about ways that EOAs might be focused, might include consideration of climate-friendly areas. We haven't outlined any changes to administrative rules related to employment lands, but I think there is still there are opportunities and guidance. And frankly, in the future, if we find that this isn't working and we need to amend those rules, I think we may well have the support to do so. You make a good point. The problem that I always see with employment lands is it's very hard to set minimum employment densities in any meaningful way. And doing so, I think, raises red flags with a lot of economic development folks that, are you kidding me? You're scaring folks away with those kind of requirements. So it's a challenge to try and thoughtfully promote that work without disincentivizing the kind of development we need to see.
I can appreciate that. So I don't have any great ideas to answer that question for you, but as we think of them, can we forward them on? And then my final question, actually my final comment is I'm going to second what Brian said about needing more time. And I want to acknowledge that the project team is hearing from a lot of stakeholders who want this work done as soon as possible, and tomorrow would be just fine. So what I want to offer you is a second to Brian's request for time, because it's not a matter of will or some resources, but really it's just, I think, recognizing that we have pretty full plates to keep our plans updated, follow up with some of the housing work to implement House Bill 2001, and we're expecting implementation in 2003 here in the next year, but also, everything else we're working on right now in terms of our EOA and some public facility planning that we're, some that we're wrapping up, some that we're going to be starting. So.
Understood.
Thank you.
We're going to move on for now. Talk about parking. You and Ben, I'm aware, are engaging in a healthy conversation about parking reform. We obviously think parking is a big lever or a significant lever to add. It's a huge land use, particularly in the downtowns and other areas that we're trying to make walkable and climate friendly. It's often overbuilt, almost, I wouldn't say universally, but very, very frequently overbuilt. So there's a lot of waste in the system. And it crowds out things that we care about. If we require in Eugene, if they require 4 parking spaces on or a spot per unit, you can build a duplex here, but if you require only 3 spots for a 4-plex, you can make that pencil. So it crowds out a lot of things, and it makes people drive more. Well, there's a fair amount of academic analysis coming out showing that it, economics works when you make something easier and cheaper, and people consume more of it. So the parking reform is drafted, does kind of 3 main things. First is it takes some of the best parking codes from Oregon and implements those. It says provisions of those are like, hey, here's how you can count parking, and here's how you can be flexible about parking mandates. Here's some things to deal with the externalities of large parking lots. And then it gives communities a kind of a 3-part choice. The first is to follow an ongoing trend around the world, which is to deregulate parking. Just say, hey, developers, you have a much better sense of the diversity of the people that you're trying to meet. And so build some parking or don't build parking, up to you. And we have a couple of decades of experience showing that works pretty well. The other 2 options focus on reducing parking requirements for certain types of development and in key areas. Option 2 also brings in unbundling and parking cash out as options, things where the people who are consuming parking are the ones paying for parking, and those who aren't paying for other people's parking. Kind of my favorite option. And option 3 just kind of says, hey, if you don't want to adopt those policies, let's deregulate some parking in more types and more areas. And the last thing is more populous communities, including Bend, would do more parking management that requires some level of parking maximums as drafted. And it also, study and set appropriate parking maximums. And it would also have a provision where you have to start pricing some of your on-street parking, 5% to start, and then 10% if you want to keep mandating parking. And you have to price it where it's actually a price signal that people will notice. It's not a $15 a year price. So this is the sort of types that we're looking at easing parking mandates for. Multifamily, the draft says can't require more than 1 space per multifamily unit. And you can't require it for parking at all for micro units, affordable housing, facilities for people with disabilities, that sort of thing. And the areas, priority transit corridors, your favorite transit corridors that you designate, and the climate friendly areas, do some parking reform in there. That's either deregulating parking or significantly scaling it back. The last thing the parking rules include is some provisions for EV charging. And it's pretty much getting over the chicken and egg that people aren't consuming EVs because they're not charging, and people aren't building charging because people don't consume EVs. We as a state have a goal to aggressively electrify the fleet over the next 15, 30 years. And so we're saying, as we're building new building, put in the conduit so those cars can be charged. It's cheap when you're building, it's really expensive to retrofit. So let's build it in there, and let's provide some service capacity as well in new buildings. And there are conformance requirements for major retrofits as well, saying, hey, if you're doing a whole bunch of work, if this isn't gonna be more than 20% of the cost, you have to retrofit EV charging in there. So those are the high level view of the parking reform draft rules. Questions? Damien.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm a little slow here with my Zoom. Can you summarize for us the differences between what kind of parking management is going to be required in climate-friendly areas versus the rest of the metro area or the city? Kind of the key things we need to think about as you look at CFA planning.
Yeah, so CFA, as written, the climate-friendly areas, communities would have two choices there. One is to not require parking in the area, let people build if they want, but don't require it, and within a quarter mile around that area, or to A, adopt a parking benefit district, B, cap your residential parking, residential per unit mandates at a half space per new housing unit, and C, waive commercial development parking mandates. So that's kind of, we didn't want to say you can't require parking at all, but if you're going to, hold on to some of your parking requirements, let's manage what we have and scale back the rest.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And the other thing that I would say is that multifamily in the latest draft, multifamily would have to be unbundled parking if you're continuing to mandate spaces there. Peter.
Hi, so I apologize if this was covered in the rule already, which I haven't read everything, but so as you know, the Bend MPO is kind of a funky boundary, and some of it incorporates rural zoned lands and some is part of Tumalo, which is an unincorporated community. So are unincorporated communities exempt from these? Because the way the boundary works, where Tumalo's boundary is from the county perspective versus the MPO boundary, if it's not exempt, we're going to have a development code almost block by block for depending where you are in Tumalo, if you're in the MPO or out of the MPOs. So I was just wondering if you're a Division 22 unincorporated community, you're exempt from the parking mandates.
Yeah, and we should have covered this at the start. This is for areas inside an urban growth boundary. So it's not looking at the MPO grant boundary, it's looking at urban growth boundaries for the, yeah.
Okay, life just got easier for me. Thank you.
Yep, sorry. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. Other questions about parking? Okay. Great, we got back up on time. Let's go on. And if you have questions or suggestions, reach out to me.
I think it's my turn again. Bill Holmstrom, again, DLCD staff, Land Use and Transportation Planning Coordinator. Happy to be with you here again today. So real quick, I want to talk about a couple of pieces of this that have to do with transportation system planning and the transportation planning rules. As I think most folks on the call know, the transportation planning rules have been around for a while here in Oregon. We've had them about 30 years or so that we've been doing coordinated land use and transportation system planning with each other under the TPR. So, I just want to say that because, we've been doing a lot of this type of work for a long time here in Oregon. We've done a lot of good things. That said, we know that, like what Evan said earlier in this meeting, we're falling short of our climate goals and where we need to be in order to meet our climate inequity goals. So we need to do more. And so what we want to do is build on the good work we've already done. I like to say we're turning up the volume on what we've already done and do more of that and build on the structure we already have that we've been successful with so far and to get to where we need to be. Next slide, please. So a large part of what we were directed to do and how we've tried to focus our rules is to focus on planning for completing connected, safe, and complete networks, particularly around pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation networks. When I talk about pedestrian networks, I'm talking about networks people that walk, but also people that use mobility devices. And when I talk about bicycle, I'm not just talking about bicycles, but electric bicycles, scooters, and other kind of whatever people invent next, you know, that operates kind of the same size, scale, speed of a bicycle. I'm going to talk about public transportation, talk about both inner city, but also within communities. And we know that, you know, if you have access to a car, if you're able to afford one, you have the ability to drive one, you're old enough to drive one, you're able enough, you know, to drive one, then you can get pretty much where you need to go, right? There's roads to get there. We know we're going to have to make some investments in our street system to maintain it, of course, but also, you know, to, especially in places like Bend, to access new development, to make more connections. That's still going to be necessary. But if you look at the completeness of the network, where we are lacking in general is going to be in our pedestrian, bicycle, and transit networks. Like we talked about earlier about public transit, how we know we need about 4 times as much transit in our metropolitan areas in order to meet really the kind of base level needs of where we need to be to meet our goals. So the rules really do focus on prioritizing those networks and making sure that we're building those out and we have connected, safe, and complete networks. We are prioritizing, in particular, and it's not, you know, exclusively, but prioritizing climate-friendly areas and making sure we're making smart investments in those places to make them places where people really can live much of their daily lives, meet their needs, go shopping, go to work, go to school, go to medical appointments, whatever it is, without having to drive a car. A lot of people still might drive to do some of those things, and that's fine. But as much as we can do that, where people aren't required to have to drive, the better off we're going to be, and that's what we need to do in order to meet our goals. The other one is, of course, neighborhoods with underserved populations or concentrations of underserved populations, whether those are, you know, racial minorities or people with lower incomes. There's a whole list of underserved populations that we have in the rule. These are places where we've potentially, you know, have not invested in the past, and there's generations of legacies of intentional or even unintentional disinvestment, you know, underinvestment or even malinvestment, where we've made you know, investments that are harm those communities. And we want to make sure that we're making that we're working with the people in those communities, and we're making investments that help them and you know, turn around some of the damage that's been done over the years to those communities. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we're building out networks that access key destinations in each of those communities so people can access the things they need in order to have freedom to live their daily lives and not necessarily have to drive a car to do that. Next page, next slide, please. So how we're planning to do this is really, you know, going through a series of prioritization processes where we're selecting projects across a variety of prioritization factors. And this is one place where we want to make sure local jurisdictions are coordinating with those underserved populations to make sure that those prioritization factors are consistent with what folks who've been underserved really need in your community. Within the local transportation system plan, we're asking that you put together a list of projects that altogether are going to help meet the climate goals, those goals that, you know, we need to meet in order to reduce the amount of driving that happens, reduce the amount of pollution that's put into the atmosphere. The other thing that we're doing is we're talking about how we measure success in the transportation system. And so we're asking local governments to broaden how they look at success, particularly when we're talking about comp plan changes or changes to the zoning. Right now, you know, almost universally, local governments use and the state system uses either a V over C or a level of service measure, which basically, you know, how many cars can get through an intersection during the peak hour. We're asking local governments to take another look at that and to look at other options on top of that, or in addition to that, or instead of that, if they choose to, that measure other values that are important to us in our transportation system. And there's a whole list of those things in there. I think we still have some work to do on this one. We're gonna have a work group on what this rule looks like, but happy to have some input on that as well. Next slide, please. So I think that was it for me. I don't know if I need to pause for questions on that piece of it.
Yeah, what questions do people have?
Bill, if I could ask this question, and maybe this may not be the right time, so please let me know. One of the parts of the rules that I'm trying to look at more closely is those around equity and the equity analysis that would be used for evaluating projects. Yep, I think you got the right one right there. To be honest, this is going to be new for Bend. We do have a newly hired equity and accessibility director or officer. I'm sorry, I don't have her title correct, that I'm trying to reach out to and get their feedback on how to best do this. But my question is, does the department already have some resources? And I think the answer is yes. I just can't think about them, can't remember them right now, that will help assist local governments as we kind of shift our thinking about prioritizing projects.
Yeah, thank you, Damon. So as everyone knows, this is the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rulemaking, and it's critical part of this rulemaking is to make sure that we're infusing equity every step of the way. And it's not just new for Bend; it's new for us. It's new for everybody, pretty much. There's some jurisdictions that have done a lot ahead of the game, but we're trying to make sure that we're doing this across everything that we're doing, and that goes for everyone in the state. Frankly, the governor's made it a high priority. So, but in terms of your question about resources, I think we do have some resources that we've generated so far. One I comes to mind is, as part of a lot of the housing work the agency has done, there's a tool, and I'm not super familiar with it. Maybe some people can step in here for talking about displacement and measuring that and looking at that to see, how can we help reduce displacement. And I'm sure there's probably some other things I'm forgetting, but part of what we're going to be doing is, once this rule is adopted, and I'm hoping even ahead of its adoption, as an agency, we have some resources available where we're going to be putting together a lot of guidance and tools for local governments across everything we're talking about here to help help on these things. And I see our Deputy Director, Kirsten Green, has got her hand up, so maybe I'll hand it over to her.
Hey there, Damien and everybody. Sorry to only be able to be here for a bit today and off camera as well, but really appreciate the discussion and being able to listen in. Damien, thanks for that explicit request. That really helps us, put a pin on, this need. And as Bill has mentioned, we know we sort of moving from rule to guidance kind of churn here. But I would like to engage our Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee in helping to identify best practices, but there's also the putting the people in the planning guidebook. That if it's not, if you haven't looked at it in a while, check it out. Sadie and the CIC refreshed it in 2018. But we will come up with new tools, and this is new, but in that section of the rule, I think it provides us that the Bill and the team have on the screen right now. I think it just provides us a different way of looking at it, which is, and you guys do this all the time in long range planning is, area plans, master plans, like really get specific on who kind of is living where and using formal and informal networks to reach folks and just kind of trying new things, whether it's mutual aid organizations or community-based organizations. But we really would like to work alongside you with this because, like we said, we're also learning, this, better engagement, more inclusive engagement is it's just improving all the time. So thank you for that explicit request. And I'm sorry I have to peel off, you guys.
Yeah. And we are also trying to have some resources as far as equity mapping, really helping provide some data layers so we can be aware of the geographic areas that are, and populations that might be impacted by various decisions. Brian.
Thank you. And this is about some of the previous slides regarding, transportation planning in general and planning rules. I think a big question on the minds of many of the folks here and city staff would be, some of the local context here around a recent adoption of a fresh transportation systems plan. So recently adopted plan, I think it does move pretty substantially in the direction of the new rules. However, it's a plan that was just approved, and then voters approved a sizable bond to go out and start building the projects in that plan. And so some of the questions we have would be around, well, when does the recently adopted transportation plan have to be amended to comply with the new rules? What would be the triggers for that? So there may be a timing requirement, just a flat, you have to update your TSP now. The next question would be if some of the urbanization work that we're considering, either through the designations of CFAs and looking at other large land use changes within the city of Bend to accommodate needed housing or employment, may also be a trigger. And then kind of a question of, well, we had a recently approved TSP and a bond was approved based on those projects. What if some of those projects could be considered capacity increasing projects that would no longer either be allowed or would be, I guess, would not be favored by the new rules. The VMT requirements and the big reductions are going to drive a completely new transportation system within the cities that will be complying with these rules to meet the climate goals. However, the cities have been investing in infrastructure and have commitments to the voters based on bonds and adopted plans that may not be consistent with these new rules. So what are the triggers? And then what are some thoughts around projects that have been where the city of Bend is committed to certain projects as a result of voter approved bonds?
Yeah, I'll tell you what the way I think the draft rules work right now, and then I'll talk a little bit about, I think, the direction that we're going to be going, or that we're talking about going. Right now, the way I read the rules, the way they work right now is you adopted a TSP, it's acknowledged, it's your existing acknowledged plan, you get to keep it until you decide to change it. There are no, I shouldn't say there are no, because there may be some specific triggers based on certain actions that the city might want to take, but there's no particular timing attached to a TSP update currently in the draft rules. So I am personally, it's one of my soapboxes is I don't like updating TSPs all the time and spending a bunch of money to do the same thing you just did. And so I don't like the 4-year TSP cycle where you reinvent the wheel. It doesn't make sense to me. So I'm sensitive to you. You're not the only jurisdiction. Corvallis recently did a TSP. Medford just did one a couple years ago. So you're not the only kind of largest city around the state that's got a new TSP. So that said, there is a lot of we're getting a lot of feedback on that in the opposite direction, which is, gosh, maybe we should be telling local jurisdictions that we need to be updating more often. Maybe there needs to be some sort of timing on that. Maybe we should, in our housing rules, we set out dates for when local jurisdictions should be doing TSPs. So that's definitely both external and internal pressures to do something like that. Now, when it gets into existing bond-funded projects, I don't think we're saying there's any project that you can't do anymore. There may be some additional review that you'd have to go through if you choose to do a TSP update, or you have to do a TSP update in order to do a particular project if it hasn't already been started. So I don't know what the timelines are on the bond projects and particular projects and things like that. It's only maybe certain projects that fall into that bucket, and I think we're still thinking about what projects exactly fall into that. And I think you're talking about Rule 830, the capacity improving projects type bucket. I think we're still thinking about exactly what's in, what's out, what does that look like. So it's still a little bit in flux, but the way I would interpret it, the rules, the draft right now is you've got an acknowledged plan, you're good until you actually need to do that update, then you'd have to meet all the updated rules.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I seem to recall that there were, and I haven't looked at the TSP rules super recently, but what was triggered by kind of a minor or a major amendment, I think what I wouldn't want to see in the draft rules is a disincentive to go back and amend the TSP. Like we have a new council that may want to change bike ped routes. But as Brian was saying, we've worked a lot with very expensive bond counsel on when we can issue debt, and you know, we have 10-year bond projects, and what you put out, there's strict rules on what you say to the voters and what you can build. So there's some complete lack of flexibility in changing projects. So what I wouldn't want to happen is try to change in our TSP some routes that are consistent with our bonds, but then be worried about doing that in our TSP because that somehow triggers us having to do, because of these new rules, puts in jeopardy our entire, you know, cycle of when we're doing some capacity increasing 8 years out, because some of the bigger, more car heavy projects are really expensive and those are out later in our 10-year. So I guess I would just ask you to like think really carefully and don't undermine what we're trying to do, which are things the state would want us to do with planning that has happened and things that we can't change. And we will never get a bond through again with our voters if they think they won't understand any of this, and we will lose credibility with doing good projects if we don't build what they gave us their property taxes to build. We are really aware of that. We're going through an issue right now with voters, and you know, you have to be careful to not make promises that you don't come through on.
Yeah, absolutely understood. I think both around, you know, bonds, but also we've heard this around existing SDC obligations and things like that, and making sure that we're sensitive to those as well. Kevin, I think this is something that we may want to talk with DOJ about, just to make sure that we aren't running afoul of any bonds or SDC issues, because you're absolutely right. We don't want to upset the apple cart with those things. I just think we need to be careful about how we do that. So we'll talk with council about that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll put it on the list, Bill.
Any other questions on the transportation planning stuff before we go over where we're at on the schedule? Okay. So this is the rough plan of the rulemaking, the calendar. We've been at this since last September, when the commission kicked it off, and we're working through next May for hopeful adoption. We are engaged in some work group meetings with, we're doing these practitioner meetings to understand some local concerns, how it might apply on the ground. We're also engaging folks in work groups to kind of do a finer look at some of the details in the rules. You can watch those or participate in those. They're listed on our website. We will have a draft of revised rules coming out Monday in the RAC packet for the Rulemaking Advisory Committee packet for meeting number 10. And then we're going to continue to refine them and adopt, get some impact statements on how this will, the fiscal impact, the housing impact, and the racial justice impact. The commission will be having meetings in February and March and May. They'll be talking about this. They've been talking about this all along. The first public hearing officially is scheduled for March, end of March or the 1st of April, and then looking for adoption in May. And we'll continue to engage people along the next 6 months to dial these in. Are there questions about the process from here out? Damien.
Thank you. So 2 questions. So for the upcoming RAC meeting on the 17th, we'll be seeing the packet on Monday, correct?
Yeah, sorry, that's an internal. Yeah, we're about to email you. Yes, we were hoping to get it
Okay.
out tomorrow, but Monday.
Monday, okay. Second question, kind of related to that, is I'm trying to distribute this to a broad selection of city staff working in transportation, community development, equity, infrastructure planning. In terms of getting you like deep dive comments where we're kind of getting into the rules, looking at verbiage, asking questions, would it help to have those at the meeting the day before or part of the follow-up comments so that you've got those to look at for making refinements after that December meeting?
Yeah, I think before, so a lot of the RAC meeting may be reporting out of what we're hearing from the work group meetings. And so having details that we're hearing from other channels then might also be nice to add into that pile to reflect back. We're getting a huge number of comments, and so whenever they come in, they will be helpful. But if it's possible to get us a couple of days before the RAC meeting so we can add it into that synthesis, that would be helpful. Bill or Kevin, you want to add on to that or correct me?
No, I think that's right. I mean, we'll accept comments that come afterwards. It's helpful if they can come before the meeting. And I do want to say we're getting a lot of very good comments, and I really appreciate your thoughtful engagement today. It's much appreciated. These are pretty thorny issues, so appreciate having a lot of eyes and a lot of smart people thinking about how this plays out.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for getting those comments to us. Other questions about the process? Oh, yeah, there's this slide. I forgot about that. Yeah, so continue to reach out to us if you want it to be distributed to all the Rulemaking Advisory Committee members. Let us know, or to the commission. Let us know. Here are the commission dates. And yeah, I'm happy to let people go early, or I'm happy to, if people want to stay on and dig into some of these things, we do have another half hour that is on our calendar as staff to answer questions or to engage.
Evan, before somebody else raises their hand, I do have one more question regarding mission input. Will the RAC be meeting again between the first hearing at the March-April meeting of the commission and then before the adoption hearing? Has a meeting been scheduled, or is it going to be scheduled if there's some tough issues that the commission wants the RAC to consider?
Kevin?
Yeah, I'd say the latter, Damien. Yeah, it's a possibility, but it's not something we're calendaring at this point in time.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Brian.
Hi, thank you. So do we, it sounds like we have a little opportunity just to kind of share some thoughts and ideas and a little less structured, less presentation. Is that what I'm picking up? I don't want to, please, if I know we all have things to do. Just some trying to reflect some of the questions we've been having as staff, and our housing director, Lynn McConnell's not here today. I don't believe she's on the call. And so it kind of gets around the issue of the interplay between a couple of different requirements that we're picking out in the rules. One would be for, essentially over time in new plans to show VMT reduction or no increase. Am I correct there? Just to start. So if we're updating our TSP or updating a big land use plan, no more increases to VMT. And so Bend has some fairly recent experience with this in trying to, reduce VMT as part of the integrated land use transportation plan and our recent TSP update. So pretty aware of what that means in terms of actual built and urban form. And so just as stepping back and looking at this, I think some of the big questions would be, what it takes pragmatically to reduce VMT is little to no UGB expansion, period. And being really essentially very thoughtful and putting all of that growth essentially towards the center or core of a city, which then reduces trip length and reduces VMT. So you're essentially having to build up the core of cities in order to hit that one target in the rules. So take away, the most powerful influence here is reducing VMT, which makes sense because you're trying to reduce emissions and carbon impacts and reduce climate impacts. And I start thinking about housing. So we have a VMT requirement, which will pretty quickly and over time prevent cities from expanding urban growth boundaries. And the only way you would be able to expand is if you continue to put more and more growth within these core areas. Core areas are already built. These are already developed areas in cities. So very few greenfield sites within any city that is a big development opportunity. There are some here and there, but by and large, these are properties that contain businesses. They're owned by individuals that the city does not necessarily compel or control. These are private land interests. So the city over time is placing public infrastructure and investments, right, to incentivize housing development and incentivize redevelopment in these climate-friendly areas and core areas, but not able to necessarily control that. And it's a little bit more, tricky to incentivize redevelopment of existing businesses than greenfields in UGB expansion areas. So when I'm thinking about all of this coming together, I think, what about single-family housing? So single-family housing in Goal 10 is a need that we need to accommodate per Goal 10. But what if that runs right up against a VMT reduction? So the cities are going to have to demonstrate that we are providing for needed housing of all types for all income levels. And we know in Bend, because of our affordability, that's a lot more attached housing product. That's pretty much the only affordable product at certain income levels. However, there is still a demonstrated need for single family housing. How do we get around this issue? Where we have a single family housing need that can't be accommodated in a climate friendly area because it's a built out area and it's just low density housing in the middle of the city. It doesn't make any sense. And yet expanding in UGB for single family housing would most likely increase VMT. Add on to that economic land needs, which Kevin, I think you did a really good job of that. You're right. Tends to be, we want more industrial land, more mixed use land. So we're putting this land, presumably some of these land types at the fringe of the UGB, but we're still having to reduce VMT. And I guess I'm concerned about that. I think it would be one thing if cities could essentially say, well, you don't have to provide for that single family housing need. You're okay not doing that. But if you're putting a city in a position where it's saying you have to meet your housing need for single family and reduce VMT, are you creating a situation where a city just simply can't do that? Or it's very difficult or technically very difficult to pull off. I'm just looking for some thoughts about that. If you've thought about that, and then kind of add in that layer of what about industrial land and economic land as well.
You raised some really good questions, and I'll start on a response, but if other members of the team want to chime in, please do. you know, the rules, again, we are trying to concentrate development climate friendly areas, but we're not saying, and the rules don't require all development to be within climate friendly areas. There will be single family. I think with House Bill 2001, I'm hoping that we see more variety and more density rather than the monoculture that we've seen with the low density single family detached monoculture that we've seen, which is not transit supportive. And as cities grow in the future, we need to grow more compactly. And, you know, I do think there is room as well for nodal development and transit corridors. So it's not necessarily that a city is going to have one core. You might have some, you know, if there were an area that's promising from a greenfield standpoint, that's readily serviceable by, you know, accessible by bike, by pedestrian, by transit, there's nothing that would preclude designating a climate friendly area in that type of in that area. I know that's easy to say. I'm also familiar with some of Bend's infrastructure challenges, and so I know that's a significant investments, just getting pipes in the ground in a lot of parts of Bend. But I do think we are trying to change the status quo. I mean, that is part of the mission here, because we can't reduce. We can't meet our climate and equity goals, you know, if we continue to grow the way we have. I don't think that means there will be no more single family detached. What I can say from an HNA standpoint is that for people who can afford single family detached housing, they pretty much can afford every other kind of housing. That is the most expensive product on the market. And so in terms of meeting housing needs, people will be able to find housing that they can afford in that category. That said, we have heard loud and clear from people that, hey, you need to allow people to have an ownership model within climate friendly areas. You know, the current rule allows only multifamily, and we know, although multifamily units can be owned through the condominium process, that's problematic. So I think you will see a proposal to expand that to allow for attached single family to address that. But we're trying to balance the density that we need to accomplish the climate goals with some of the other goals as well. But again, some of that density can filter out from climate friendly areas. It doesn't need to be a, you know, here's our climate friendly area, now it's low density residential, and we know you know that. So I think there's some finesse, and I think there's a lot of learning that we all need to do, and you know, some learning that we can do in terms of kinds of development that are successful, and we're seeing more and more of that around the state. Frankly, Bend has produced some pretty cool mixed use stuff in recent years, which, you know, when I started going to Bend decades ago, was kind of unthinkable. So, I mean, progress can be made, you know, but I know it's challenging. If anybody else wants to chime in, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, I don't think we're certainly aware there's a variety of challenges to actually implementing what we would like to see on the ground in climate friendly areas. You know, we have, you know, LCDC has the control to guide how land use works and to, you know, kind of reduce hurdles and burdens in land use. We have some control over how infrastructure planning for transportation works and making sure that we're making the right kinds of investments in those places. But there's a whole host of other things that need to happen there to make the market work, to make, you know, a developer be able to come in and make a development pencil in those places. There's a lot of us, it's stuff that happens, and we've heard land availability loud and clear. That's a challenge. I mean, what can we can only do what we can do. We can only move the levers that we have access to. But what I can tell you is we've been talking to other state agencies to see what else the state can do. And you know, I can't guarantee anything is going to happen, but you know, we're going to continue even after the rulemaking is over, just to try to do as much as we can. We've talked with home builders yesterday about this. We were talking with local governments these next couple of weeks about this. This is, for me, this is really, I think, a super important thing for our agency to lead on, even if we're not necessarily going to be able to do it ourselves, is to how are we going to make these things work? How are we going to make it work for cities? How are we going to make it work for developers or private owners? And And I'm not sure we're going to have all the answers. The state can, but as much as we can, I want to do that, and I'm open to any suggestions on that.
If I could maybe just chime in on the VMT part of that question. So I just want to be clear that we are changing the way the VMT definitions are working from the existing TPR to the new one. And you're right. It's the financially constrained list should be, per capita. Stop digging the hole is the way I put it. Just, let's make it go down. We're getting pushed really hard to say like, no, that should have a target on it. Well, I totally agree with you. Like, this is really hard and challenging, and our targets are built on these kind of aspirational, what would it take to get there? And so that's where the illustrative list kind of comes in. We give that to you, say, hey, if you're going to meet this target, show us what it would take, show us your full build out of your dream TSP that it would take to get people to reduce VMT. And it's not even like, don't drive, it's just reduce it 20%. I mean, that's like work from home one day a week, right? It's not like crazy. But in this, we give you a lot of credit of the state and federal policies and regulations that are coming down the pipeline. Carbon pricing is coming to Oregon. The EQC is meeting on that this month. And those are the kind of things that will help move the needle more than you probably had seen the needle move before. And I think really, in my mind, give a more fair, balanced look at what the future is kind of holding for the fleet fuel technology and the way people get around in the state. And I'll just, share also, City of Portland is very firm about this. They're like, we can't build our way out of the problem. We need software. We don't need hardware. We've invested in a lot of hardware. We need some more, but you really need the software, like the TDM and some of the strategies and policies to kind of activate that stuff. So why single family homes, yes, those are important, but they're not the only lever. Parking policy is huge. Parking pricing in key employment areas is huge. If you have big employers that have free parking, people will probably drive. So there's a lot of things that can be done to kind of help you achieve that. And I think we've done a lot of work with ODOT and, making sure that we're not out over our skis on that and that they are achievable. And we've been doing a lot of this work over the last 10 years in the scenario planning work to show that, these things are achievable and it isn't just one thing. So it's not just you're going to do it with land use. It's going to be a coordinated kind of approach to get there, but we feel confident that you can do it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And all of this was just we're trying to find there are linkages throughout the rules and then with other rules that are not being modified. So as we look at them as a team, wait, how can we do this and this? How can we meet this requirement and that requirement? So it's a lot about trying to explore these topics to understand if you're looking in these other places like you're looking at goal 9 as well, and how goal 9 interplays with some of these the climate friendly rules. In this package of rules, same thing on goal 10, how can we meet all these housing types if we may not be able to easily accommodate a single family housing need in a traditional form? Well, that would suggest other forms, but these are the things that we're thinking about to try to get the rules to work better. And so that it's clear when you're administering and then we're having to apply them at the local level. So none of this is pushing back on the rules, it's trying to understand the interplay between all these different requirements that keep moving too. So it's kind of hard to follow the bouncing ball sometimes. But thank you.
And I'm assuming you all have probably way more robust discussions than I do. And I know there's the whole charging station parts of the rules, which seem great, but I mean, we all are doing reading on the future of autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles. I was just reading an article about how Oslo is planning their future. And it isn't really about reducing VMT. It's about planning their cities for a new kind of getting around. I mean, Bend has snow all winter and we have a terrible transit system. So sometimes it just strikes me as we've done a lot of work on density, but there's only so much land. And if people keep moving here, we do have this big concern that will just become less and less affordable and more expensive if we don't expand. I mean, we all can tell the stories of the Vales and the steamboats, and we know the places that has happened to. So that's something that we think about, like the future may not be no cars, especially in places that you cannot. I mean, many of us here bike, but sometimes in the winter, I'm not up for getting on my electric bike. It's too damn cold and there's too much snow on the ground, no matter how much I went. I'm too old now. In my 20s, I could do it, but not now. But I'm hoping to get a little electric car that I feel safe in. Right now, there's too many big trucks in Bend, but I think that's going to be a different future. So sometimes when I think about like this push to get everybody out of all infrastructure, that, I mean, I guess I'm just reading about it. So everybody's not doing that in the world. And so I get a little confused sometimes by these rules and by this notion that nobody should be in a car building it, because I'm hoping the future is not going to be carbon cars, but something completely different. I mean, I just got off of FSEC. I was on the Energy Facility Siting Council, where, you know, that's a whole nother way of getting at carbon issues, right? With wind and solar and hopefully hydro and other ways of energy. That's another way to get at this problem. I know you come at from the land use way, but I just wonder how much you think about that in these rules.
I want to clarify, we're not saying no cars, no driving. Like, that's not at all accurate of what we're doing here. We're saying we need to reduce a per capita basis, the amount of that people have to drive. So we're kind of just trying to right size the system that's a little outsized. We've been doing 100 years of planning for the automobile. You know, we've got a pretty good system. What we really need to start looking at is building out the systems for other modes to be as good as that, right? So I think that really, to meet our greenhouse gas goals, it's going to require a little bit less driving. It's going to require cleaner fuels and cleaner cars. Yeah. Those are the three things. And there's no way that electric cars are going to save us. It's just not happening. It's a part of the mix is reducing the amount that people have to drive. And we feel like there's a lot of geometry problems that come with cars, and 1 million more people in the state. You know, taking up that much space with automobiles really, you know, takes up a lot of space in your city and makes housing more unaffordable, and all the things that Evan talked about at the beginning here. There's 30% of people in the state aren't able to drive. And so we're looking at just creating a more fair and, you know, equitable investment streams of how we're doing this. But for sure, not saying that they are going to be part of the future. And, you know, I drive to the supermarket with my kids, so I'm not like some, you know, that's a necessary thing we have to do. And we realize that.
Other questions or comments?
Another question I have in some of the sections is timing. And we've talked about that a fair amount, but I was looking before the meeting on something that's near and dear to my heart because I manage the accessibility department, but there's the sidewalk inventory requirement. And sometimes I couldn't quite tell from the rules how much is prospective and how much is something that you do for existing conditions, and when is it supposed to be done. So that's just something I think we would ask you to help jurisdictions understand, when are we talking about new development and requirements that we impose on new, which is always the easy one. When is this something that cities are being expected to do with existing conditions? And if so, what's the timing? That wasn't always clear to me in reading through the rules. Like, what are we supposed to do? Is this the entire city? Is it just climate friendly area? Like, what are we supposed to do and when? Would be helpful to know what the intent is.
Yeah, we've certainly heard that feedback. and we're hoping to distribute a first draft of that with the rack packet. But there's some more details that will need to be filled in and populated to be most useful to local governments. We're aware of that. Yeah, having 8 people draft 100 pages of rule, like it's not all clear. Totally admit that. And so we've got 6 months to clean it up, but we want to be clear. Other things?
So Evan, just before we wrap up, the post-meeting survey that'll go out by email, not just the chat. I wanted to confirm.
Yes.
Thank you. And I've already covered the rack packet. All right. So I have to start looking at that this weekend. I can wait till Monday night. All right. Thank you. And thank you very much for scheduling this meeting. I think it was just good to have this time to pepper you with the questions we ask each other, and it was good to have an opportunity to ask somebody who could help us answer those questions.
Yeah, thanks everyone for making the time. And please do be in touch. Help us improve these rules, make them the best possible. Appreciate your support and interest. All right.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
take care.
Thanks, everyone.